hands, how many in here have ever cooked beans? Quite a few. Well, unless you always buy the canned ones, that means you probably know that beans are best soaked before they're cooked. But do you know why they ought to be soaked? Well, that's because beans and seeds and grains contain so-called anti-nutrients that protect them from insects, bacteria, viruses, and the like. For the beans to be edible, nutritious, and not cause any unnecessary gases, these anti-nutrients need to be soaked away. And the reason soaking does the trick is because it makes the beans believe that they are safely in moist soil and that it's time to sprout. So they let go of their protective anti-nutrients and release super healthy enzymes and actual nutrients to help them grow. The point here is not to inform you on how you can avoid getting gassy from eating beans, but the soaking, the water. You see, what I'm going to talk about tonight is in all likelihood not new to you. You've heard it before. The seed or bean has already been planted. But the soil of your minds might be a little bit on the dry side, a bit thirsty. So what I've set out to do here is water it. I want to water away the resistance you may have, your anti-nutrients, so that your seeds can sprout and grow into strong beliefs and guiding principles. Your resistance, or anti-nutrients, is made up by the label consumer that we tend to hide behind, or at least see ourselves as limited to. And the reason we need to get rid of it and sprout is climate change. These two things, climate change and us as more than consumers, is what I'm here for tonight. The case I'm going to make is that neither a bottom-up nor a top-down approach to tackling climate change will work on its own, because without a bottom, there is no top, and vice versa. If you're not quite clear on what bottom-up and top-down means, don't worry, we'll get there. I'll take you through my personal experience of the bottom-up approach, then we'll move on to the top-down, and eventually we'll land in the connections between the two. Our generation has more awareness of climate change and more tools to halt it than any of our predecessors. What's more, we're also most likely the last generation who can do something about it before it derails completely out of our control. Because of its urgent and global nature, climate change is, I'd say, the defining question of Generation Y. How we deal with it will determine whether future generations are proud of us or ashamed of us. Our societies clearly need to change in response to climate change, and different ways to go about that is either for the bottom layers of society to initiate change that then sort of organically spreads to the top layers, or for the top layers of society to lay down regulations that the bottom layers have to abide by. Now, what counts as top and bottom is a relative question. If you compare a resident of a city with the mayor of that city, the resident is the bottom and the mayor the top. While if you take that same mayor and compare him or her to the president of the country in which the mayor's city is situated, the mayor is suddenly the bottom instead, and the president the top. However, people with little direct involvement in politics, who don't own businesses with a lot of employees and who on top of that don't have children, they might not experience themselves as part of any top. And I think that many of you in here, along with me, can identify with that. We don't have the power to regulate or impose much on anybody. So, as the bottom we are, we might take Talita's advice and make damn sure that we become the top. And on our way towards that, we might choose to combat climate change by adjusting our own habits, by becoming conscious and conscientious consumers. A few years back, when I first moved out of my parents' home, this was my ambition. With this new home and life for me to shape, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to introduce sustainable ways of doing everything. So I dove into research on everything from plant-based diets to green energy to wooden toilet brushes. I decided to stick with my cheap plastic one, but as you can see, the wooden one would have looked so pretty and just natural, you know? Apart from how expensive wooden toilet brushes are, what I soon discovered is that what it means to live sustainably is a mess. Advice comes from all imaginable sources, many of them contradict each other, and then economic interests and greenwashing just makes everything all the more blurry. So, to clean up the mess and create some structure and clarity for myself as well as for my fellow Swedes, I made a website. I wanted people to only have to go to one ordered place to get informed on diverse matters such as whether organic food is truly more sustainable than conventional, and what contraception options there are that don't make fish infertile. The website developed quite well. I reached an audience that did not completely consist of my closest friends, and I got invited to hold presentations on sustainability and climate anxiety. There was just one problem. You see, the more reports I read and links I followed, the more evident it became that consumer power can only take us so far. Turns out that an entangled mess of advice is not the only obstacle standing in its way. Basically, what I eventually could not deny were these three facts. For people to change their ways on their own accord, they need to have 1. Moral conviction. 2. Time on their hands. And 3. Money. Because let's face it, beans may be cheaper than beef, but as it is today, figuring out and choosing what's sustainable is anything but cheap and convenient, no matter how well I've structured the information on my website. That's simply how the system is set up. Many people know this, which is why they don't even want to try. Climate change is huge and complex, and to us living in Europe, a so far rather abstract problem. What impact does each of us have, really? Isn't this exactly the kind of problem that we have governments for? Which takes us to the top-down approach. Like I briefly explained earlier, the top-down approach in this context basically means imposed sustainable measures by governments that the rest of society simply has to comply with. Against the background of the three obstacles I just mentioned, moral conviction, time, and money, I believe that those imposed regulations that favor the sustainable are absolutely necessary. Because the majority of people will not choose the sustainable options until those options are the most convenient ones. This is where it gets really interesting, because what does this mean? That ordinary people ought to just lean back and wait for their governments to make sustainability standard? Not quite. In a conversation with a friend of mine, who is one of my fiercest and so also one of my most valuable critics, he said that it's very admirable and all that I hold talks and write articles to change public opinion, but that I'm quite naive in thinking that will make any big difference in the foreseeable future. He sees me as a bottom-upper, and he told me that the bottom-up approach is too slow, that for the necessary changes to happen quickly enough, we need large-scale regulations imposed from the top down. Now, with the insights my website brought me, I fully agree that relying on the bottom to change the world as consumers is rather naive, but I also agree with what another friend interjected at this point of the conversation. He said, and this is key, that the first friend was quite naive himself in his perception of policymaking as the answer. If I remember it correctly, he said, quote, "You can't just become elected and think that the rest of Parliament will agree with what you think should be done. If there's anything that is slow in this world, it's politics." Like a bean in protective anti-nutrients, I was so comfortably wrapped in the label consumer when I made my website that I forgot we are more than that. I forgot that we are citizens. What my friend forgot is that politicians in democratic societies, though they surely have their own values as well, tend to do what gets them re-elected, while politicians in less democratic societies tend to do what decreases the risk of public uprising. So, crudely speaking, governments do what the public want them to do. Or, if the public is quiet, what lobby groups want them to do. The bottom cannot be expected to live sustainably with all of society's incentives turned against them. But the top has little reason to change the direction of those incentives unless the bottom asks for it. It's a two-way thing. Like I said in the beginning, without a bottom, there's not much top to speak of. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with making sustainable choices in private. Actually, the more of them you make, the better. But if there's one thing we should do above all else, it's to demand in public that those choices are made easier. That way, we can get to a place where everyone lives sustainably out of sheer laziness. Now you might wonder, how? How do we demand things in public exactly? Well, for us living in democracies, the most obvious thing to do is to use our right to vote in national elections that are held every 4th year or so. But there are lots of options in the considerable time in between those elections, and for those of us who are not yet of age as well. For example, well, you see them all here, regional and municipal politicians are generally much easier to reach by phone and email than national ones. Many newspapers welcome opinion pieces from the public. Demonstrations can be joined or organized, and petitions can be initiated by you, signed by you, or delivered by you to the concerned parties. We should also keep in mind that the institutions we work in, even private companies, are platforms where we can exercise our citizen power. And the same goes for schools. Actually, the smaller neighborhoods and communities we live in, too. Everywhere we go, really, we can let it be known that we want sustainability as standard. Like Naomi Klein wrote in her book, "This Changes Everything," we have done it before, and we can do it again. The civil rights movement happened, the suffragette movement happened, and so did the anti-apartheid movement. We can learn from them, and we can do it again. Actually, we already are. More and more people are experiencing the effects of climate change and other environmental and social damages the fossil fuel industry leaves in its wake. They are gathering and they are demanding system change, not climate change, in the US, in India, in Greece, in Germany, in China, Nigeria, South Africa, Ecuador, you name it. We do not all have to devote ourselves to being full-blown activists, but we need to remember that we are more than consumers. We need to sprout and be the kind of bottom that activates and even becomes the top. Now, I hope you feel nicely soaked, and that when I leave this stage, you will take over the task of watering from me. Because a seed doesn't just need water to sprout, you know. It also needs it to live on. Thank you.